So again, the Director of Jewish Studies at Muhlenberg College. We want to welcome Dr. Jessica Cooperman in that role as she focuses on 20th century American Judaism and Jewish culture and on connections between religion and state policy in and about the way that Jews of new realms and other members of society, other religious groups, other social groups, I guess, have interacted in a kind of equality, a sense of camaraderie, companionship, or otherwise. And she'll tell us more about that. She is going to look at Passover Seders and Jewish Christian engagement in post-war America. And I'll let her really give you the full context of her work, but we are delighted that we are going to get to hear some of your really innovative thinking and new thinking tonight. And that's part of what we love, to be involved with scholars, both who have written great books like your book about making Judaism safe for America, and working on new materials to really think through and about in your director's position. So again, I'm gonna welcome everyone. I'm gonna spotlight Dr. Cooperman's video after I make her a co-host. And remember that you can go up to the corner, and instead of being on gallery view, you can put it on speaker view, and she will be front and center. And again, we welcome you. We're so glad you took time. I know you have a lovely family, and you took time away for us, and you are such a clear thinker. Your scholarship stands on its own. And of course, I can't say she's here because it's the middle of the night, but Shuli wishes she could be here.
Tell her I say hi, please.
Well, and she sends her very best, and good luck with Hatzlacha tonight.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Cooperman.
Hello. Hi, everybody. I have to say particularly hi to Natalie Friedman, who I haven't seen in a long time. Hi, it's nice to see you. Thank you to Rabbi Scott Bolton for this invitation, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight and for having me as your guest speaker. This is, as Rabbi Bolton was saying, new research that I'm working on. I'm this semester a fellow at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been working on this project in connection to that fellowship. And so I'm really excited to have the chance to present what I have so far to you guys, and I absolutely welcome your feedback, your advice, your insights, your suggestions. Can everybody hear me relatively well? Okay.
Dr. Cooperman, would you like people to put some thoughts and questions in the chat as we go, and then maybe you'll decide if you're going to take a break in the middle or wait till the end, okay?
Yeah, I think so. So I have to tell you, I have like multiple screens that are going to be going on. I'm going to share some images with you. So usually I'm very comfortable just sort of interrupting and taking questions as we go. So feel free to put things in the chat. I'm not sure what I'm going to be able to see where. So bear with me if we take some of those questions later on, but I'll try to check back and forth with the chat, or if something is unclear, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask a question, and we'll go from there. Good?
Great.
Okay, I am going to see what I can do here. Hang on. I'm going to minimize. Nope, wait, hold on. All right, bear with me. I made all this work before. Let's see if I can do it again. I'm going to share this screen. Can you all see a screen? Oh, wait, but yes, I'm getting a thumbs up. I'm going to take that. Okay, so you can hear me and you can see my screen. Thumbs up. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, so this screen is my shameless plug. I am, as Rabbi Bolton said, Associate Professor of Religion Studies and Director of Jewish Studies at Muhlenberg College. And I have my email there. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to continue this conversation after tonight's talk. So if you have questions or thoughts, please feel free. My previous project was indeed about World War I and about American soldiers' welfare programs and changing ideas about American religion, and particularly how I argued in that book that government policy and military policy helped to create the idea of a Judeo-Christian America, right? A country in which Protestant, Catholics, and Jews were all equal partners in American democracy. In this latest project that I'm starting to work on, I'm interested, I think, in what I'm describing as cases of interfaith gone awry, right? Cases where that impulse towards developing Jewish-Christian relations, interfaith relations have maybe not had the same sort of outcome that the people who started working on them expected or anticipated. So I'm going to start with a story. A few years ago, I was at an event for at a Jewish-Christian interfaith organization, and a Lutheran pastor struck up a conversation with me about the Passover Seder he had recently led at his church. He was particularly pleased with it, he explained, because while he always saw Passover as an opportunity to advance the cause of Jewish-Christian understanding, the assistance of a local rabbi had helped him to create a truly authentic Seder experience for his congregation that year. Our conversation left me feeling surprised. Why was this pastor leading a Seder at his church? And what was the understanding that it was advancing? When I checked in with the rabbi to get his take, he confirmed that the pastor had reached out to him with questions, but he took care to tell me that he had no involvement in the event and no idea why the church would hold a Passover Seder. For the pastor, the rabbi's involvement was crucial. It made the Seder authentic and imbued it with the spirit of interfaith worship. The rabbi, on the other hand, was careful to put a good deal of distance between himself and this ritual about which he claimed to know very little. I proceeded to bother friends and acquaintances with questions about Christian celebrations of Passover, and it was interesting to note that while many of the Jewish identifying people I spoke with were unaware of the practice, my sister-in-law, by the way, still thinks I'm making the whole thing up, many of those who identified as Christian had either attended or had chosen not to attend church-based Seders. Among these conversations, two were particularly striking to me. In one, an acquaintance in his 30s who identifies as Catholic argued that Passover was an uncomplicated part of the Christian tradition. Jesus was a Jew, Jews celebrate Passover, therefore Christians celebrate Passover, and as far as he knew, they had always done so. And I think maybe his age is interesting to note in there, that he's a fairly young person. Because in another conversation I had with a Jewish friend in his 60s who had helped to lead a number of Christian Seders, he argued that these were not authentic Seders, but that they were an opportunity for Jews to convince their Christian neighbors to, in his words, hate us a bit less. So the differences between these responses and reactions raise questions for me about the ritual, its purpose, and its connection to interfaith understanding. What does it mean for Christians to celebrate Passover? When did this practice become common? And in what ways are these celebrations connected to Jews or to Judaism, if at all? What moreover might different forms of engagement with the holiday of Passover help us to notice about the history and dynamics of Jewish-Christian interfaith relations in the United States? Okay, so I'm going to try to, okay. I think I have my multiple screens going. All right, so Passover, oh, nope, can't do that. Passover is in many ways the paradigmatic American Jewish ritual. According to the 2013 Pew Research Center study on Jewish Americans, the Passover Seder is celebrated more often than any other Jewish holiday, and about 70% of American Jews, including those who do not identify with Judaism as a religion, reported attending a Passover Seder in the previous year to that study, right? And so I just have some of the results from this Pew study, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, right? Gauging what sort of Jewish rituals American Jews have participated in. Passover Seder is number one. People who affiliate with Judaism, who identify as Jews by religion, it's almost 80%. fasting on Yom Kippur, lighting Sabbath candles, keeping kosher, and observing other restrictions for the Sabbath are much, much lower on the scale. So just as and breaks down further by Orthodox, different denominations, you can see the sort of breakdown of numbers there. And we can look more at that Pew study. But just as a sense, Passover Seder is the holiday that American Jews celebrate more than any other. All right, but since the last decades of the 20th century, Passover has also been widely adopted by American Christians, becoming so popular by 2011 that one Wall Street Journal writer speculated that Passover might soon become the new Christmas. Here, okay, I've just scrolled this one down. Wait, hang on one second. Here, okay. And Passover is actually not alone in this. The adoption of Jewish rituals by Christians is a phenomenon that appears to be very much on the rise in the United States, as well as internationally. Scholars and observers of contemporary Christianity have noted that since the early 2000s, growing numbers of particularly evangelical Christians have embraced symbolic markers of Jewishness, such as the presence of ketubot and chupot at weddings, or the carrying of Torah scrolls and the wearing of talitot and kippot at church services, and have adopted these as components of Christian religious ritual and practice. Anthropologist Hilary Kale notes that these widespread Jewish affinity practices, as she calls them, are most popular among Christians with no personal or familial ties to mainstream American Jewry. So I have here just a couple of examples that I found on the internet of Christian ketubot, of marriage contracts that are specifically written and marketed to Christians. This one you can obviously see, right? Both the shape of it, the idea that from the bridegroom, the bride has redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of her trespasses according to the riches of his grace, which he lavishes on her, right? The language, the form, the artwork clearly is directed towards a Christian audience, even though it is using this, what Hilary Kale would call Jewish affinity practice, right? And this one, maybe you can help me sort of make sense of. I was looking for examples of chupot, wedding canopies that were used specifically at Christian services. And I've heard lots of stories about them, but I couldn't find a great image. And then I came across this one from Brides Magazine, which is not directed particularly to a Christian audience. And it was talking about how wedding canopies are like the latest thing and everybody should have a wedding canopy. And so I picked this image, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of this idea that everybody should be married under a chuppah, but happy to hear your thoughts on it. Okay, so my project over the past several months has been to learn about Christian celebrations of Passover and its rituals, and I'm really happy to have a chance to share what I've learned so far. First, while the Synoptic Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, portray Jesus' Last Supper as a Passover Seder, it seems unlikely to me, as a non-expert in American Christianity, certainly, but maybe in a contradiction to my acquaintance who insisted that Passover was an uncomplicated part of Christian tradition, it seems very unlikely to me to think that the Seder has enjoyed a long embrace by Christian communities. And in fact, even if we look back only as far as the early modern period, European Christian engagement with Passover rituals seem more characterized by suspicion than by any sense of shared religious commitment. Yaakov Deutsch, in his study of early modern ethnographic depictions of Jews and Judaism, notes that while the early modern period witnessed an uptick in Christian interests in Jewish rituals, the goals of this new scholarship were largely to demonstrate the superiority of Christianity over Judaism. So while Passover received significant attention in the ethnographic works of the time, Deutsch notes that analyses often emphasize the absurdity of Jewish beliefs and rituals, the gluttony and ignorance exhibited at holiday meals, or the outright threat to Christians posed by Jewish practices. And those are expressed perhaps most famously in stories dating back to the Middle Ages of Jews murdering Christian children in order to use their blood as part of the preparation for the Seder. And I have here an image of a case of what was known as a blood libel, right? An accusation that Jews used the blood of Christian children to prepare the matzah, or in some way to prepare themselves for the rituals of the Seder. This is a famous case, or depiction of a famous case of blood libel of Simon of Trent from 1475. And if you are feeling too happy and want some really depressing literature to read, there's a scholar named Magda Teeter who teaches up at Fordham University, who has a spectacular book on blood libel that came out last year, in which she traces both cases of blood libel across Europe from around the 1200s into the 19th century, and how blood libel figured into European legal structures. And then if you're after that feeling still too happy, I found this image of a contemporary blood libel painting that was displayed just this past year. So there you go, in case you're feeling too cheerful. Here, we'll move on to a slightly happier image there. Okay, so aside from the fact that we have this complicated and long European tradition of seeing the Seder as not only not something that is inherent to Christian practice, right, but it's something that is inherently threatening to Christian bodies, right, to Christian children, right? Even the question about the historical validity of the Synoptic Gospels' claim that the Last Supper was a Seder is something that scholars have really debated over the years. There is a vast body of literature discussing the intertwined histories of Easter and Passover, but the arguments they have made about the relationship between Easter and Passover have really changed significantly over time as scholars have reassessed the historical relationships between Judaism and Christianity, right? So the idea that Passover and Easter, that Passover and the Last Supper, that Passover and Christian ritual were historically intertwined is something I really want us to question pretty heavily. So as an example of this shift in scholarship, historian Israel Yuval explains that in 1925, when the New Testament scholar Robert Eisler, who was probably not coincidentally a Viennese Jew, published an article in an academic journal comparing the Passover afikomen with the Christian host, the journal's editor, a man named Hans Lietzmann, was so scandalized by the comparison of Jewish and Christian rituals that he demanded that the second part of the article be retracted. When he was forced by Eisler's lawyer to let the article run, Lietzmann, who was an expert on the Last Supper, conceded, but only on the condition that he could insert a note to readers explaining that he was being forced to publish this article in spite of the fact that it didn't meet the scholarly standards of the journal. That was in 1925. By 1955, however, scholarly consensus around the relationship between Passover and Christian ritual had clearly shifted. In a review essay in Theology Today, Professor Krister Stendahl of Harvard Divinity School argued that while one of the most influential books in the modern study of the Eucharist is Mass and the Lord's Supper by Hans Lietzmann, who had battled against the attempt to connect Passover with Christian practices, a newly translated book, The Eucharistic Words of Jesus by a scholar named Joachim Jeremias, was attempting to prove against Lietzmann that the Last Supper was in fact a Passover Seder. Stendahl's review notes that Lietzmann and his colleagues had for many years represented the dominant scholarly consensus, and that he had some skepticism about Jeremias's revolutionary claim, but he described the book as startling and refreshing. By 1966, however, the tide of this debate had completely turned. In a review of the latest English translation of Jeremias's book, J. McHugh, writing in New Blackfriars, noted that when the book first appeared in German in 1935, quote, the severance of the Last Supper from the Passover was by the vast majority accepted as so axiomatic that argument in a contrary sense was regarded as almost freakish. But, he continues, Jeremias's deeply serious work had proven that such a position was false, demonstrating that even in the fourth Gospel of John, there are many traces of a tradition according to which the Last Supper was a Passover meal. So this is a pretty profound sort of revolution in how Christian or scholars of Christianity, scholars of the New Testament, thought about the relationship between Passover Seder and Easter. Shifts like this in scholarly consensus are not at all unheard of, but this one does bolster my suspicion that Christian celebrations of Passover have not always been the norm. Professor of Comparative Theology, Marian Moyart, agrees with me. In her study of Catholic celebrations of Passover, she argues that, quote, until recently, the dominant theological discourse was one of highlighting the discontinuity between Jewish and Christian traditions. Only following the declaration Nostra Aetate by the Second Vatican Council in 1965, she argues, did Catholics rediscover the Jewishness of Jesus and begin to view Jewish rituals like the Passover Seder as part of their own Christian heritage. The year in which Jeremiah's book was reissued, 1966, and the seemingly radical shift in scholarly consensus that it represented, reminds us that these academic debates did not take place in a vacuum. The 1960s were times of profound change in the Christian world and in the history of Jewish-Christian relations. Historian of American religion, Kay Heelan Gaston, notes that as late as the 1950s, American Catholic leaders shied away from even using the term Judeo-Christian for fear that it would suggest that Judaism and Catholicism shared a common theological denominator. The embrace by both Catholics and Protestants of what had historically been a suspicious Jewish ritual implies a significant change in thinking and not just among academics. So here, I'm going to give you a piece of text. Okay. So Moyart's claim that we should consider Nostra Aetate, the Catholic Church's declaration on its relationship to non-Christian religions, as a turning point makes a good deal of sense. In this declaration, the Vatican sought to reconfigure the Church's attitude towards Jews, declaring, and you have it up on your screen as well as mine, as the Sacred Synod searches into the mystery of the Church, it remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the New Covenant to Abraham's stock. The Church professes that all who believe in Christ Abraham's sons according to faith are included in the same patriarch's call, and likewise that the salvation of the Church is mysteriously foreshadowed by the chosen people's exodus from the land of bondage. The Church, therefore, cannot forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament through the people with whom God, in his inexpressible mercy, concluded the ancient covenant. Since the spiritual patrimony common to Jews and Christians is thus so great, this Sacred Synod wants to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect, which is the fruit above all of biblical and theological studies, as well as of fraternal dialogues. Now, following this statement, the idea that the Passover Seder, a ritual once seen as demonstrating Jewish deviance and ignorance, could be embraced and celebrated by Christians becomes more comprehensible. As scholars reconsidered Jesus's historical identity as a Jew, Nostra Aetate recasts Judaism itself as part of a shared spiritual patrimony relevant to both Jews and Christians. The paradigmatic Jewish holiday of Passover, commemorating the Jewish exodus from Egypt and transformation into a cohesive national community, could now be celebrated as part of the foreshadowing of the salvation of the Church and as a site for mutual understanding. The Catholic Church, moreover, was not alone in its efforts to rethink the relationship between Jews and Christians in the mid-1960s. I'm going to give you, somebody entered the waiting room. There, okay, some more quotes. In May 1964, the Lutheran World Federation renounced anti-Semitism as an estrangement of man from his fellow men, declaring that anti-Semitism is, quote, a denial of the image of God in the Jews. It represents a demonic form of rebellion against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and a rejection of Jesus the Jew. In June of that same year, the General Board of the National Council of the Churches of Christ in America proclaimed that, quote, the spiritual heritage of Jews and Christians should draw us together in obedience to the one Father and in continuing dialogue, and urged the, quote, the members of its constituent communions to seek that true dialogue with the religious bodies of the Jewish community through which differences in faith can be explored within the mutual life of the one family of God, separated but seeking from God the gift of renewed unity. By the summer of 1967, the World Council of Churches declared that, quote, encounter with Jews is essential. Ongoing encounter with Jews can mean a real enrichment of our faith. Christians should therefore be alert to every such possibility, both in the field of social cooperation and especially on the deeper level of theological discussion. Taken together, these texts clearly demonstrate that the 1960s is a profound moment of change. But I would argue that they argue for two related but not identical types of change. The first concerns the possibility that through meaningful engagement with what we might call Judaism, right? Bible, theology, spiritual heritage, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Christians might deepen their own faith and their understanding of Jesus the Jew. The other, however, concerns engagement with Jewish people, who might serve on the one hand as a conduit to that religious understanding, and who additionally should no longer face anti-Semitism from Christians, as anti-Semitism is itself a rejection of Jesus the Jew and of God's saving design. It's easy to see where these concerns overlap. By engaging reverently with the texts and practices of a group of people, one might come to respect them. And by engaging respectfully with a group of people, one might themselves be enriched. But there are also lots of ways in which these goals can be separated, such that one could wish to engage with Judaism in the hope of deepening a connection to Christianity without necessarily having much interest in Jews. Or one could hope to fight off anti-Semitism without much engagement with Christianity. And these possibilities seem important to consider when thinking about the impact of these shifts in church policy on Jewish-Christian relations, as well as in considering these new engagements with Passover Seder that are going to emerge in the late 20th century. Now, while the fraught history of medieval and early modern Jewish-Christian encounters during the Passover Easter season may offer us reason to think of the Seder as an unlikely site for improving interfaith relations, the structure of the Jewish Seder actually makes it a great starting point for experimenting with a new ritual. Unlike many holidays, the Seder is generally celebrated at home and led traditionally by a male family member. One does not need special expertise or clergy status to lead the ritual, nor must one attend religious services in a synagogue to celebrate the Seder. And perhaps even more importantly, the Seder comes with its own instruction manual, the Passover Haggadah, which tells the Passover story and explains how the ritual should be observed. So while the history may be fraught, the Seder is actually quite user-friendly, particularly in the 20th and 21st century United States, where one can easily find English translations of the text that allow anyone, regardless of education or background, to make the Seder their own. Now, the earliest example that I found of a Passover Seder intended specifically for use in Christian settings was actually published by the Jewish Anti-Defamation League in 1954. And you have I know it's not a great image, but you have the cover of it here. The Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, was founded in 1913 as an advocacy group with the mission of combating anti-Semitism. Their Haggadah was originally printed in the March edition of the Christian Friends Bulletin, an ADL newsletter intended for outreach to Christians. It was then reprinted as a standalone publication simply called Passover Haggadah. The introductory paragraphs claim that even at this early date, Passover had become a significant event in Christian communities, declaring that, quote, the Passover celebration is now demonstrated in many church schools and congregations throughout the land, and is happily another indication of the growing awareness on the part of Jews of the meanings and observances of Christianity, and on the part of Christians of the meanings and observances of Judaism. The authors offer their hope that increased knowledge of the Seder ritual will, quote, help in small measure to further a fuller realization of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Now, it's very hard to verify the text's claim that demonstrations of the Seder had already become a widespread practice in the early 50s. It's certainly possible that Christian communities hosted Seder demonstrations, maybe led by local rabbis employing a Haggadah text intended for use in Jewish homes, and that this new text was meant as a tool to help formalize existing Christian practices. But it also seems possible that this text, which doesn't really differ significantly from other English language Haggadot, was printed and distributed in order to help shape a new Christian understanding of this once mysterious and suspicious Jewish ritual. I'll move to one more image. It's a little blurry, I'm sorry, but it's just the end of the same Haggadah. Like many other 20th century non-Orthodox American adaptations, this Haggadah omits the traditional Hebrew text request that God should, quote, pour out his wrath against the heathens who will not acknowledge you and who have consumed Jacob and ruined his home. Rather than asking God to, quote, pursue them in rage and destroy them from under the heavens of the eternal, it instead hopes that, quote, he who broke Pharaoh's yoke forever will shatter all fetters of oppression and hasten the day when swords shall at last be broken and wars ended, so that mankind, freed from violence and from wrong and united in an eternal covenant of brotherhood, may celebrate the universal Passover in the name of our God of freedom. It's a prayer that makes sense in the context of post-war America, with its focus both backward to the end of the terrible violence of World War II and ahead to the growing civil rights movement. It also clearly seeks to shake off historical perceptions of Jews as a threat to their Christian neighbors, and instead to put forward a vision of Jews engaged alongside their neighbors in a shared celebration of freedom. When thinking back to the goals set out in Nostra Aetate and in those Protestant statements issued around the same time, however, it seems clear that this Haggadah is interested in using the Seder as a tool to diminish prejudice and anti-Jewish sentiment, a goal which is very much in keeping with the founding mission of the ADL. But it's worth noting that the text has little obvious interest in using the Seder as a means to help Christian observers relate to Jesus the Jew, nor does it purport to offer Christians a way to make this ritual their own. It's intended for educational purposes, and the education it offers is largely about making this Jewish ritual comprehensible and non-threatening in post-war America. This educational model of the Haggadah uses the Seder as a tool for promoting mutual respect and interfaith understanding, but it's generally careful to mark the difference between Jewish and Christian tradition. A post-Nostra Aetate example is Rabbi Balfour Brickner's 1969 Interreligious Guide to Passover and Easter. Brickner, who was the founder and director of the Reform Movement's Commission on Interreligious Affairs and co-director of its Commission on Social Action, opened his text by explaining first and foremost that his booklet was a guide, not an actual Haggadah, and that it was not intended for use at a Seder. The guide, he informed his readers, required the participation of both a rabbi and a minister to read the lessons, and it should be used only for study. Don't try this at home. Brickner wanted his audience to engage in a detailed exploration of Jewish and Christian practices in order to make them better partners in American life. But he was committed to emphasizing the boundaries of difference between the two holidays. In his introduction, Brickner explains, the interreligious openness which characterizes much of America's current religious life brings Jews and Christians together on an increasingly complex level. When we share common social values, we seek to intensify our cooperative actions in the community. Working together towards the solution of common social problems stimulates the desire jointly to study one another's belief and religious practices, the better to understand our differences as well as our similarities. No two holidays offer a finer opportunity for interreligious study than Passover and Easter. For while Easter has its roots in Passover, it is obviously different from it. A study of the difference can help Christians and Jews better understand some of the basic ideas which distinguish them from each other. Brickner's guide also offered a comparative lesson on the historical and ritual similarities, but most importantly, the crucial differences between Easter and Passover. And this focus on appreciation of difference informed other interfaith guides to Passover as well. Rabbi Leon Klinicki, who served as interfaith director of the ADL in the 80s, participated in writing an updated Passover Haggadah, which in 1985 was published jointly by the ADL and the Liturgy Training Program of the Archdiocese of Chicago. In his introduction, Klinicki tells his readers that the Seder explains the essentials of Judaism, which he describes as election by God, solidarity with the poor, history, heritage, and the actuality of oppression. Klinicki then chronicles a history of Jewish oppression, stretching from Egypt to blood libel accusations to Nazi concentration camps and ghettos. He dwells on these tragedies of Jewish history, presumably in order to help his non-Jewish readers better understand the meaning of the Seder, the significance of which, he argues, lies in the hope it brought to Jews in moments of suffering, quote, in concentration camps, living in ghettos, hiding under friendly roofs, or in the forests. It brought hope to Anne Frank and her family. Klinicki's Seder story is tied directly to Jewish history and particularly to legacies of anti-Semitism. It reaches across religious boundaries in order to help Christians appreciate the values, the pain, and the distinctiveness of Jewish experience. It's an approach to interfaith work that focuses on reducing Christian prejudice towards Jews, not on the religious experience of Christians. Perhaps not surprisingly, however, Rabbi Klinicki's Catholic partner describes the Passover Seder in very different terms. Gabe Huck of the Archdiocese of Chicago introduces the Seder by explaining, for a generation now, great numbers of Christians have been learning about the Jewish festival of Passover, and especially about its special ritual, the Seder meal. In large and small groups, Christians have begun to celebrate the Seder meal. The motivation for this has been various, but experience has led many to the same conclusion. We do not come to the Seder as a history lesson or to a restaging of the Last Supper of Jesus. We come to the Seder to acknowledge common biblical roots. Eventually, we will certainly find that we belong here at Passover around this table telling this story. But what story? Klinicki's story seems more akin to the one told to me by the friend who explained that by participating in Christian Passover Seders, he could perhaps reduce hatred against Jews. The story that Huck tells represents perhaps a different model, one that acknowledges the educational strategy of his Jewish partner, but also seeks to make a place for Christians to find their own sense of belonging at the Seder table. The two stories are related, and both are reflected in those 1960 church statements, but they're not the same. And as Christian Seders developed, they often moved away from attempts to educate Christians about anti-Semitism and Jewish distinctiveness, and instead reflected new social, scholarly, and theological claims about Christian investment in Judaism as part of their own religious heritage. This doesn't mean that the educational model of the Haggadah disappeared, but it faced competition from interpretations that focus less on the Seder as a path to understanding one's Jewish neighbors and more as a ritual for Christians to help them better understand their own religious identity and their relationship to Jesus, who becomes the only Jew really required for a Christian Seder. So in the Passover meal, a ritual for Christian homes, published in 1972, Sister Arlene Hines opens her text with extended quotation from the Catholic Church's 1969 working document on Jewish-Christian relations as a way of framing the purpose of her work and the relationship between Passover and Easter, stating, quote, at this time, Christians and Jews celebrate their own feasts in their own ways, and we can see in these celebrations of Easter and Passover the common bond of the symbolism of the Exodus. Jesus was a Jew, and today we wish to draw upon the traditional Jewish Seder and the words of the New Testament to help us more fully appreciate Jesus's observance of his Jewish heritage. Why do we eat bitter herbs tonight at this special meal, she asks. The Jews of old ate bitter herbs on Passover night, as do the Jews today, because our fathers were slaves in Egypt and their lives were made bitter. We who are followers of Christ do not hesitate to taste of this bitterness as a reminder of his passion and death. Hines depicts three groups of people present at the Seder: the Jews of Christ's time, the Jews of today, and the Christians of today, all of whom have different but equal places at the table. In other models, however, the Jews of today are increasingly pushed to the side or rendered unnecessary to the ritual. Sometimes, as in James Emerson's A Christian Seder from 1976, the Haggadah opens with stories about Jewish friends and the charming folk customs he observed at their Seder tables, like opening the door for Elijah in the hope that a young man might be there to marry an eligible daughter. But the text proceeds without distinguishing between ancient Hebrews, modern Jews, and Christians, so that when we went forth from Egypt, we are the Christian participants in the Seder who read passages from the Reform movement's Union Haggadah interspersed with readings from the Gospel. Or in Sam McIntosh's A Passover Seder for Christian Families from 1986, in which he thanks Jewish consultants in the acknowledgments, but assures his readers that the Seder is his to pass on without the need for rabbinic or Jewish guidance or approval, proclaiming, "The Passover Seder is a festive meal, begun at sunset on the evening of the full moon in early spring. During the meal, we retell the story of Exodus from Egypt as we eat bitter herbs and unleavened bread. The booklet contains the text of the Seder as my wife and I celebrate it with our family and friends." And here are just some more images of Christian Haggadot, and there are more out there. I'm collecting them to prove to my sister-in-law that I'm not making this up. That's not really why I'm collecting them, but it's an added bonus. So one interesting place that modern day Jews sometimes remain visible in these Haggadah texts is in the food served at the meal. Almost all Christian Haggadot, as well as some Jewish ones, offer instructions not just on how to perform the ritual, but also on how to clean and decorate the home, set the table, and prepare symbolic foods. Many, however, also include recipes describing appropriate meals for the occasion. In a Passover ritual and menu for observance by the book is called A Passover Ritual and Menu for Observance by Christians from 1984. The author, who identifies herself as a Jewish convert to Christianity, offered detailed menu suggestions. No flour, no ham, no pork, no dairy, only kosher oil. For appetizers, she suggests chicken soup with matzah balls or small kosher egg noodles, vegetable broth, borscht served hot or cold, and gefilte fish, as well as hard-boiled eggs dipped in salt water. For the entree, she recommends that all meats and poultry be labeled kosher. Chicken can be fried with a mix of matzah meal and seasonings, but brisket of beef or roast lamb are also recommended. In these menus, the selection and preparation of mid-20th century Ashkenazi Jewish foods seems intended as a way of lending the Seder an air of Jewish authenticity, while keeping the text and ritual focused on the Jewishness of Jesus, rather than on that of modern-day Jews. But even in this culinary connection to contemporary Jews or Jewish culture is increasingly rendered optional. For example, a Presbyterian Haggadah from 1970 assures its readers that, quote, "The Seder is an opportunity for transcending difference among separated brethren, Christian and Jewish, Catholic and Protestant, but it also reassures them that these differences will be fully transcended with the ultimate and universal acceptance of Christ." Quote, "The Seder has a significance also for all mankind. The Pharaoh of the Exodus is symbolic of the tyrants of our day, as well as the tyrants of every era in history. In Jesus Christ, who is our Passover, this freedom from tyranny is passed on to all men. By the power of his life, death, and resurrection, all men are made free. The freedom given to Israel by Yahweh becomes the freedom of the new Israel, the church. It is then a freedom offered to the whole world through Jesus Christ." In this model of Christian Haggadot, Jews, Judaism, and Jewish interpretations of the Passover story disappear entirely. And interestingly, so do Jewish food traditions. Here's another image for you. I think you'll all pick up on the complexities of this recipe. Sam McIntosh's A Passover Seder for Christian Families offers very detailed descriptions of what to prepare for the Seder, including this recipe for roast leg of lamb. Anne's roast leg of lamb for 12, 9 pounds of lamb, trimmed of excess fat, garlic, oregano, salt, black pepper, lemon juice, onions, orzo, dry red wine, tomato puree, and a cup of grated Parmesan cheese. The recipe is interesting for its deviation from virtually all Jewish dietary restrictions. Milk and meat are combined, and pasta, which is forbidden during Passover, is included. The choice of menu could simply reflect a lack of understanding of Jewish dietary law, but I find that very unlikely. At least to me, it seems that it reflects a lack of interest. This Seder is, after all, for Christian families who have no obligation to engage with any particular Jewish Seder rituals. Jews and their practices are erased from the text, and the Jewish Seder is superseded by a Christian Seder, much as traditional Christian teachings describe Judaism itself as superseded by the coming of Christ. Okay, so this is my new favorite genre of literature, so I'm just sharing lots of images of cookbooks and diet books with you. Particularly, I was fascinated by this one, The Food and Feasts of Jesus, the original Mediterranean diet with menus and recipes, which was published in 2014 by Roman Littlefield. And the authors are Douglas Neal and Joel Pugh. It's advertised as a cookbook, and the authors offer menus and recipes intended to allow readers to eat the foods that Jesus would have enjoyed, as well as detailed descriptions of how he would have celebrated the festivals of his time. And I know, I teach in religion studies, right? I should be open to, but I just find it funny to think of the disciples' diet. I don't know, it just kind of cracks me up. So I'm happy to hear what you guys think about it. Okay, so in the 2 chapters of this book, The Food and Feasts of Jesus, 2 chapters are dedicated to Passover, and the authors there attempt to transport readers back to the Jerusalem of Jesus's day. The city, they report, would have been festive, containing, quote, elements of the 4th of July, Thanksgiving dinner, and a road trip with friends and family. Wealthy Jews, they explain, often kept second homes in Jerusalem in order to be able to stay comfortably during the holidays. But they note Christian Jews carried tents and stayed modestly in neighboring communities. The streets of the city they describe were dangerous, filled with pickpockets, thieves, and unscrupulous merchants, zealots, and revolutionaries, but the Jews were committed to celebrating. The authors explain that, quote, a law in the book of Deuteronomy required that Jews set aside a tithe of their harvest for a celebration. Can you imagine a modern law requiring that we use a certain percentage of our income for vacations and feasts? Apparently, most Jews took this seriously. Not only did they eat and drink much more than usual, but they used the feast as an opportunity to buy special clothing, luxury items, and household wares to take home with them. Some pilgrims gave money to caterers, who then prepared their meals for the rest of their stay in Jerusalem. This text seems almost like a throwback to those early modern descriptions of Passover, in which the Jewish ritual presents potential dangers to the Christian pilgrim and emphasize the gluttony and materialism of the Jews in contrast to the sincere and humble Passover of Jesus and his followers. The Jews of today do not appear in the text at all, except perhaps through a recipe. While Jewish dietary law specifies that the baking of Passover matzah must be entirely completed within 18 minutes, lest the flour and water mixture have any time to rise, Neal and Pugh, the authors of this book, instruct their readers that in order to make matzah as Jesus would have eaten it, one should knead the dough thoroughly and then let it rise for at least 30 minutes before rolling it flat and baking. The suggestion here seems to be that the matzah modern Jews eat for their Seder is not truly authentic. Indeed, the authors trace the many changes to the Jewish Haggadah that have taken place over the centuries. Only the modern Christian Seder, they seem to imply, based on their imagined depiction of the life and times of Jesus, can connect its participants back to the true meaning of Passover. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody again for a moment. So what do these different approaches to the Seder tell us about interfaith dialogue and the efforts at reconfiguring the relationship between Jews and Christians that came out of the late 1960s? First, I do not think that all efforts at interfaith dialogue and understanding inevitably lead to the kind of supersessionist story that we see clearly in that last example. There are lots of smart and sincere people involved in interfaith dialogue, and many of them are alert to the ways that shared ritual can too easily slip into cultural appropriation. I do, however, think that ideas are very difficult to police or control. Once the idea of Christian Passover Seders emerged, people made their own place at the Seder table and adopted its rituals as they understood them. Some Christian denominations, aware of the problems of appropriation, have taken care not to explicitly endorse Christian Seders, but neither do they expressly forbid them. And because the Seder is conducted in the home without the need for clergy and with its own instruction booklet, they are well suited to being a do-it-yourself religious ritual, easily adapted and interpreted as desired. And this is part actually of what made researching Christian Seders challenging. I'm happy to talk about that too. Haggadot written by rabbis for use in Christian settings can be seen as an attempt to control the ways that Christians understand and engage with the Seder ritual, but they seem to have only had limited success. In a country in which Jews represent perhaps 2% of the total population, there are surely not enough rabbis to effectively lead all Christian celebrations of Passover, and it's hard to claim that most Christians or Jews would want this. In April of 2017, Rabbi Yechiel Pupko and David Sandmel published an article entitled "Jesus Didn't Eat a Seder Meal, Why Christians Shouldn't Either in Christianity Today." They argued that Christian Seders are ahistorical, as the Seder traditions observed today did not exist in the time of Jesus. And like the rabbis who wrote educational guides to Passover for Christian communities in the past, they stressed the importance of the differences between Judaism and Christianity. The critical responses they received asked what authority these men had to police Christian religious practices. Messianic Jews, moreover, asked what right these traditionally Jewish rabbis had to speak for all Jews, or even to define what counted as authentic Jewish religious practice. The challenges presented by Christian Passover Seders tell us something about the larger challenges of Jewish-Christian dialogue. Scholar of American religion Cahilan Gaston argues that since the 1960s, Americans have often talked about a shared Judeo-Christian heritage, but that they have often brought wildly different and even opposing goals to that conversation. The example of Seders helps us to appreciate how widely the intentions behind shared rituals and interfaith dialogue can diverge. In the years following the declaration of Nostra Aetate, as well as Protestant statements about Jewish-Christian relations, Jews, it seemed, entered into discussions about the connections between Easter and Passover, primarily in the hope of reducing anti-Semitism experienced by some contemporary Jews. And some Christians clearly shared that goal. But many, understandably, prioritized the other component of these statements, the desire to engage with the Jewishness of Jesus, rather than with lessons about the history and distinctiveness of a very small group of people that many of them might never really encounter in person. Given these related but different goals, how should we understand the possibilities and limits of modern Jewish-Christian dialogue? What voices are present in the conversations that result? And how should we reckon with the demographic realities that assure that these conversations are always between numerically unequal communities in which Christians represent a large majority and Jews a tiny minority? Christian Passover Seders, in spite of their origin in new ideas about Jewish-Christian relations, are Christian rituals whose connection to Jews and Jewish practices are somewhat tenuous. And this perhaps helps me understand how I could become a scholar of American Jewish history without knowing anything about them prior to the conversation I had with a Lutheran pastor. But I suspect that I should know more. These Seders help us appreciate something about the ways that Jewish-Christian relations have changed, but also stayed the same since the theological and scholarly upheavals of the 1960s. They raise interesting questions about Christian perceptions of Jews in post-war America, and I would argue that they allow us to appreciate the dynamic and ever-changing religious terrain that Jews navigate within American society. All right. Thank you. That's all I have to say, but I'm really interested in hearing what you guys have to say.
Really excellent, really excellent. Think of your questions and formulate them so that you can ask them in a minute or two. I'm just going to offer a few reflections at the end of your discussion here and have you react a little bit after I give you a couple of different thoughts right away. First is, as you were flashing the documents on screen from some of the books in the 1950s, and then in terms of Nostra Aetate and the foundational documents that tried to redefine the relationship of the Vatican with religious groups outside of Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you can just make a I'm gonna go three different directions here. One about documents, one about a personal rabbinic reflection, one a scholarly question about the work in modernity. So how do you really weigh the gravitas of letters and those documents produced in the 20th century? As we sit here and think about Marcus's collections of Jewish texts from the Middle Ages and bulls from popes and all kinds of foundational documents of nation states that reimagine what Western democracy looks like, and Western conceptions are really about organizational life in political realms. How do you see religious documents and church documents and books by church officials as a scholar, sitting aside those very foundational documents with gravitas? Do you see it the same amount of weight, and we're just so close to it that we don't take it as historical, but you see it as foundationally historical and others will in the future? Or are we just living in an age where there was more paper around, there were dittos, there were typewriters with carbon paper, there were then computers and word processors, and now talk is cheap, to the extreme. So I wonder, sitting in the Penn Cat Center, where you can steep yourself, folks, this is the very spot behind Independence Hall where scholars sit who have been given the privilege to really look at something in depth, and we're so impressed, Dr. Cooperman. How do you see those documents? That's number one.
Okay.
Number two, if I was doing a reaction a little bit quasi-academically, this is a very focused set of observations about the supersessionist doctrine and dogma that seems to be coming out with these Christian documents. I wonder what it would be like to, and you may not be interested in this at all, so it may not be an area. I wonder what it would be like to interview rabbis who have been approached by different church leaders in different church branches to be part of their Passover celebrations, and how those Seders are really conceived of by those leaders. I'll give you one example. At an early stage in my own career, I was part of an AME Black Methodist African church, where the Seder at Pesach time that they conducted was a freedom Seder that combined Jews and Blacks during Chol HaMoed, and asked the Jewish communities who were invited into their space to bring kosher food and or authentic Passover food to share, and to combine in a committee form before the holiday to write a Passover Seder, a freedom Seder of our own, based on the foundational freedom Seder that was around during the Civil Rights Movement, which you must have heard of in your investigation. And then my final question is, just a simple one. Are there any communities who have really used Hebrew? And is Hebrew ascendancy on the rise in Christian communities as a heritage language? So those are the three areas that I'd ask you to think about aloud.
Sure, thank you. Those are great questions. And I see there's one in the chat as well. So to your point about documents, I actually think it's really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, I do take these documents seriously, right? I think if the Catholic Church comes out and makes a statement, right, comes out of Second Vatican, right? Like this is, I think that this is an important document to notice, to pay attention to take seriously. But I was at a talk, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago that was led by a Catholic scholar, very involved in interfaith relations and thinking about the connected history of Judaism and Christianity. And she is a renowned scholar, Mary Boyce, right? And it was interesting that Nostra Aetate is, the mid-1960s, and she was actually still trying to convince her audience to take seriously the lessons of Nostra Aetate, right, in 2021, right? This was just a couple of years ago, and it seemed to me she was still kind of rehearsing the same argument that had been made all these years prior. So on the one hand, I think that we want to pay attention to and take seriously the weight of documents and proclamations like Nostra Aetate, like the one coming out of the World Lutheran Federation and other church bodies. But we always need to remember that there's going to be a gap between institutional statements and proclamations and the lived experience of people. Where I would push back a little bit is I think that was always true. I think even those documents that Marcus collected and that other collections of, famous people, I think maybe the gap there was at least as big, if not bigger. And in fact, I mentioned Magda Teeter's really spectacular book on blood libel somewhere earlier this evening, right? And one of the interesting things she does is that she traces both the sort of popular narratives of blood libel and the legal documents around it. And the legal documents, even coming out of church bodies, in the Catholic Church in particular, right, repeatedly say, or at least always have voices within them that say, this is nonsense, we should stop this. This is really not an accurate claim. And they'll have proclamations saying, knock it off, blood libel is nonsense. And yet 50 years later, there will be another accusation of blood libel that emerges because it's part of the popular culture, and that gap always exists. So I feel like as a historian, you want to be thinking seriously on both levels, right? Thinking about the way those kinds of grand proclamations do shape a certain form of discourse and a certain form of response and action. Having legal proclamations makes a difference, but you always want to be sensitive to the fact that there's probably a difference between the sort of discourse up here and the lived reality of people as they go about their lives. In terms of the reactions to rabbis, yeah, I bring it on. I want to hear all kinds of reactions from rabbis. I'm super fascinated by that. I have spoken to a couple of rabbis, not as many as I would like, who have been approached to be involved with interfaith and particularly Christian Seders, right? And I'm not so much talking about interfaith Seders that are for like interfaith families, which I think are very common in the Jewish world, right? But these are where a rabbi is invited to go into a church setting and specifically to lead a Seder for a group that is predominantly Christian. The Lutheran pastor I spoke to, there were no Jews present at his Seder. And I've heard different responses to how people think about them. A lot have sort of at the end of the day leaned towards the need to fight anti-Semitism, that this becomes an opportunity to represent Jews and Judaism well in a non-Jewish space, and how important that is to how people, particularly rabbis, see their mission, their role in the broader American community. I'd love to hear more about your experiences leading a Seder at this AME church. I did do a little bit of research on the original Freedom Seder, which was written by a guy named Arthur Waskow, who was not a rabbi at that time, but became a rabbi a little later in his career. It was led in 1967, and the first one was in Washington, D.C. And what was interesting, and why I didn't sort of wrestle with it in this paper, although I may go back to it, is that as much as it was intended to be a Seder focused on interfaith, intergroup, multiracial, multi-ethnic celebrations of freedom, the form of it was really quite traditionally Jewish. He wasn't sort of looking at that relationship to Easter and engagement with Christian liturgy and Christian theology. He was taking the form of the Jewish Seder and then using texts that emphasized the civil rights movement and a commitment to sort of global freedom, which I think is a related but slightly different project. And I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do with that yet, but that is a whole other stream of Seder innovations that come out of the 1960s. Oh no, and then for your last comment, I just wrote down communities, but now I can't remember what I was going to say.
Just about Hebrew. Is anyone,
oh, Hebrew.
Have you found a Christian publication that outside of Israel? Because I've seen in Israel that it's been done, but here in America, and is Hebrew education on the rise?
Yes. So I I am hoping to work more closely with that anthropologist who I mentioned earlier on in that paper, Hilary Kale. We've never met in person, but we've been trading lots of emails, and she does work on contemporary evangelical communities, both in the US and then internationally. And she has definitely attested in her research to the rise of this broad array of Jewish affinity practices, including the increasing incorporation of Hebrew words, phrases, terminology into Christian religious services, and then some engagement with the study of modern Hebrew. I think right now what I have seen more of is this kind of just like bringing little elements of Hebrew into Christian religious settings or Christian sort of church settings, not so much a full-blown study of the language, but I'm sure that's there as well. And in fact, Hebrew Bible scholars have long been, particularly Protestant scholars, have long been invested in biblical Hebrew. So this is a different path, but I'm sure that it is there. And certainly Christians who travel to Israel
Definitely
learn Hebrew in that setting as well.
Yeah. You got a couple of questions down in the chat if you want to just take a quick look.
Yeah. So I see this interesting question from Phyllis about the growth of interfaith dialogue and of Jewish political power and influence in America. And I really like that question because I'm kind of toying with the idea that interfaith dialogue kind of works the opposite way, that it's almost like about delusions of grandeur. I don't know how to put that in a better way, right? That there's this sense in which you have these largely rabbis, but also communal leaders starting in around the 1950s, right? Proposing that they're going to, reshape how Christians think about Judaism. And like they're this teeny tiny little minority of the population. Like, how are they going to control how Christianity in the United States, let alone in the globe, is going to see Judaism? Like, how are they going to effectively manage that? So on the one hand, I don't want to downplay the significance of Jewish political influence in American culture and American politics. I think that is a real thing. And I think that having Christian organizations take interfaith seriously is in many ways a sign of that. But I think there's this kind of flip side of it too. Like I've gone to a bunch of lectures where people talk about like Rabbi Mark Tenenbaum is single-handedly responsible for the Nostra Aetate statement, or Rabbi Heschel is single-handedly responsible for Nostra Aetate. And like, I'm not a scholar of Nostra Aetate, but if you read histories of like Catholic discourse, they didn't need some rabbi to come and tell them what Catholic theology is going to look like, right? There's a big institution. The idea that Jews have the power to control what Christians are going to think and what Christian theology is going to look like, I think is perhaps a delusion of grandeur. So I'm
Dr.
still
Cooperman,
working on that one.
In Masechet Avodah Zarah on page 8, the Romans go to the Persians and they say, we've got the Jews and the Torah scroll on our side. you better give up the mantle of leadership. We just studied this on Wednesday night. Yes, Richard? So, Dale, we know that, it takes a Jew to move history.
Jews, I guess, have been historically very convinced of that.
You've got a question about the art if you know about it. And then, Charlie, if you got your question in.
I see. Okay. I have to say, I don't know that much about that particular painting. I was looking for a nice image that wasn't the sort of an image of, I think the older painting is just, sort of Renaissance era, but the Gasparo piece I hadn't encountered. I was just sort of Googling, and there are a couple of articles that came up about it. I think there was one in the Israel Times. So we will all do more readings about it, right. I imagine. But yes, it was actually quite a disturbing image.
Sounds good. Charlie, do you have something? You're muted. So we see your mouth moving, but.
I still haven't gotten used to Zoom.
Mm.
Given that Jews accept the fact that there are other religions around, and not only that there are other religions around, we use them. Like, we're going to sell our hametz to a non-Jew. a week from today.
Right.
There's a whole concept. I have a whole book on the Shabbos Goy somewhere on one of my shelves. So, not only do we accept the fact that they're non-Jews, we sort of use them to like help our religion move along or our culture move along, however you want to think about that. Whereas other religions like Christianity, we usually think of them as beating on us for one reason or another. The whole concept of the blood libel. You even presented stuff that showed that even now today, they think we're doing the Passover Seder wrong. I mean, why? Like you tell me a bunch of Christians are doing Passover Seder. I said, yeah, sure, fine. I really don't care how a Christian's doing the Passover Seder. Go have fun. You're not doing my Seder. Do you think there'll ever be peace? I can't see how there'll ever be peace between other religions, and it's not just Christianity, and Jews, because we don't care if the other exists, and all the others take us as an affront. What do you mean you don't accept Jesus? What do you mean you don't accept Allah? Because they found the new way, and we're still us. So are we just spinning our wheels when we involve ourselves in this? Or is it getting us anywhere?
That's a really interesting question. And it is one that I've been thinking about. Like how, and there's this debate among American Jewish historians in particular, but people who study Jewish history more broadly about how much should we connect contemporary either anti-Semitism or philo-Semitism, right, to longer histories, right? How much do we want to say like, no, each historical context and situation is specific and needs to be understood in its specific context, right? Contemporary America, 19th century America is not the same as 19th century Russia, and is not the same as 13th century Italy, and is not the same as, right? And how much do we want to be pulling out sort of through lines that connect these different time periods in spite of their differences? So I guess on the one hand, I don't want to say there is no point in having conversations, right? Because the situation in the contemporary United States, the situation in the United States since the 1960s, right, is actually better in many ways than what was going on in Russia in the 1860s, right? I think that there are, right, back to Rabbi Bolton's question about like those big proclamations do make a difference. Sometimes they have a place in legal structure. Sometimes they have a place in policing and government policy, right? And so I don't ever want to be dismissive of the importance of those ongoing conversations. But I do think that on the other hand, there is real complexity to these conversations. And the Jews do pose a kind of theological challenge, sometimes a problem, but certainly a challenge within Christian teaching, both Catholic and Protestant. And I think that there was a real effort in the 1960s to resolve that challenge or to come to a better space in that relationship. And again, I want to take that very seriously. But I think that the proliferation and then sort of multiple new manifestations of these Seders becomes one example of how grand proclamations don't necessarily control the way people behave on the ground. As to your point about do Jews care about their surroundings, I totally hear what you're saying, right? That Judaism doesn't have the same theological problem vis-a-vis these other religious traditions, Christianity and Islam, that they have with Judaism. But I think that Jews do actually care a good deal about their neighbors and their place in these broader societies. And I think that Judaism, even at times when it doesn't want to admit it, does change and adapt quite significantly in response to the context in which Jews live. So I guess I don't despair, but I think that these are very complicated relationships and sort of teasing out what is happening under the surface. I guess part of why I said I was drawn to like these stories of interfaith gone awry is that interfaith becomes this, or Jewish-Christian relations, Jewish-Christian understanding becomes this like big umbrella term that sounds like all nice and good and like filled with, I don't know, candy canes and bunny rabbits and chocolate covered matzah. But people came to that dialogue, right, with very, very different goals. And they didn't always admit what those goals were up front. But if you start sort of picking away, you can see that there are different agendas at work. And so I don't think you can make a lot of progress in the dialogue unless you begin to appreciate what are the different agendas and goals that are motivating people to have those conversations. I'll read the
Give you another example quickly.
Yeah.
The second time I was ever approached by anyone about how to make a Seder or sharing this bridge of we both celebrate a Seder was when I was at a reunion with Amy at Haverford College, and we were sitting under a big tent, and it was actually Shavuot. And we were balancing between attending lectures on campus and walking 3 miles to the nearest synagogue in Philadelphia. And so this young lady, who was a friend and a wonderful soul, who's doing all things with a pure intention, says, you know, as she's talking about Shavuot with me and the Passover holiday that started the whole period, which she's knowledgeable about, you know, you really don't need a Haggadah to have a Passover Seder. You know, we're really learning about that in our church. Now, that's not supersessionism as in, I think small of you, I think you're a threat. You obviously are wrong by not accepting Jesus, but it was, in a certain way, soft supersessionism, let's say, that in America, even though it's so good, if we're careful students of what we hear from some of what's the learned culture after those kind of moves that you're tracing in your research, we get a sense that, like you argued for tonight, that authenticity is no longer something we can claim on the very laws of the Old Testament, which was that Old Covenant, which can be reinterpreted without Jewish commentary. And part of the disputations in the Middle Ages and part of that heritage of displacement of text with new commentary is a lived experience and a textual experience, which I think you're hitting upon. It'd be an interesting kind of moment in time to see how certain prayers were avoided so that we didn't have, you know, broigus with the neighbors. And then how texts changed from our perspective vis-a-vis Christians versus how Christians change our text.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like, I find that all super fascinating. And I think that we have this sensibility that in the Middle Ages, right, there were disputations in which people Jews and Christians debated theological issues and, right, had those kinds of conversations. But we don't think of that as going on in the contemporary United States. But in fact, I think I would argue that it goes on in the contemporary United States, at least in the circles in which people are having these conversations. And I'll actually take my own statement back. It's definitely happening in the circles in which people are having those conversations. And it may actually be going on in a much more broad circle of people who don't realize that they are having those conversations, right? Apropos of your comment about Christians learning Hebrew, right? They may not realize they're in a theological disputation with contemporary Jews, but there's a way in which that is part of a theological disputation about what is Judaism and how does it fit into the American landscape. And so I'm interested in seeing what we can learn about that. So Passover is kind of a starting point for that. I'm not sure that the whole project will be just on Passover Seders, but it just really, because I encountered this Lutheran pastor who told me something I had never heard of before, right? It started me kind of down. A friend of mine said I should describe it as like the Easter Bunny's rabbit hole of Passover Seders. So something like that.
Well, that is a great title for an upcoming article or book. We will definitely be watching for it. It was an incredible talk tonight. Thank you very much for just such thoughtful work and clear presentation. What a delight to have you with us. We only wish that last March you were able to come with the whole family and be here in person. Maybe one day we'll all
One
be
day.
able to get together and learn more and have you in person and make Shabbat. Let's
I hope
let's
so.
hope. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim.
Lashana Haba together.
Amen.
Yes, please.
Just a logistical note for our community. A Shabbat Shalom to everyone early. Please tune in on Sunday after Minyan at 10 o'clock. I'm going to give a talk looking at the Talmudic take on questions at the Seder. Can we reorder the order of the Seder? I'll be talking about novel ways of making something new happen at the Seder. How can it be different this year? And talking a little bit about this physical space of Seder making and Talmudic and other texts that give us a little bit of hints and clues as to what novel kind of way we can renew and make different our Seder experience this year. So join me Sunday morning for that. Zooming in, zooming out of Shabbat as well, and wishes for a great Hachanah Pesach. Serious preparation ahead. Enjoy.
Thank you all so much.
Thank
Thank you for
very
coming,
much.
It's been a
everyone, and thanks
pleasure.
again, Dr. Cooperman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So wait, Natalie, how do you know each other? You guys can hang out for a minute here. I'll keep the Zoom on.
Okay.
That would be great. We went to grad school together.
We did.
I'm going to stop the recording.